lot of people get into management thinking that it will be very similar to their current role, just with some one-on-ones with people every week. In reality, the individual contributor components really take a back seat. The most important part of being a manager is making sure that your team is executing on the tasks that the company needs you to execute on. And as a manager, you really own the success or failure of that, although the best managers own the failures but share the success with their team, of course.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Hatchpad Insight. I'm Tim Winkler, the creator of Hatchpad, the community for startup technologists. If this is your first time here, don't forget to hit subscribe for updates on new insight interviews like this one. Today, we're chatting with Jeff Nettleton, a staff software engineer at Color, a health tech startup based in California. Jeff, thanks for hanging out with us at the Hatchpad.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
For sure. Why don't we start with a quick intro on your background leading up to your current role with Color?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing software engineering since 2005. Back then, it was a lot different than it is today. Web apps were just entering the scene. And yeah, I got started by working on open source software just out of interest when I was in high school. Got a first job back then through a friend and worked in the proto-internet space for the first 5 years of my career. Spent a couple years tilting at windmills in politics after college, but got back into engineering after not being an engineer from about 2010 to 2013. From there, it was clear that web apps were the name of the game. In 2014, I started at Aledade, which is a health tech company in the DC area. I was the first engineer there, really built out their infrastructure and their web app, as well as the team, moving into a leadership role as the director of engineering. And in 2018, moved out to the West Coast, spent a couple years at Honor. And then late last year, during the peak of the COVID pandemic, I started at Color. And I'm here today. At Color, I'm the tech lead, which is a non-managerial leadership role on the data platform team. That's presenting back to our partners and customers all of the data that we generate internally for them. So Color does, for instance, genetic testing, but it also does broad scale COVID testing and vaccinations. So our partners being state departments of health, universities, they pay for people in their populations. So the students and faculty of a university, for instance, or the population of a city for a city department of health, they pay for them to be tested or vaccinated. We present the data about who has taken tests, what were the results of those tests, how many tests have they taken, et cetera, via dashboards. And so my team builds all of that out, as well as the core authentication platform. On the side, I also do a lot of our database performance optimization, maintenance, upgrades, et cetera.
Nice. Probably a large amount of data you're dealing with in a post-pandemic world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What's the size of Color from a headcount and maybe from a venture perspective?
The company as a whole is about 500 to 600 people these days. The engineering and product team are about 80 people in total. That's including PMs, designers, et cetera. From a venture perspective, we recently had our Series D, and that was about $160 million raise. And if I recall correctly, that put us at about a $1.7 billion valuation.
Aledade, you started there as the first engineer. What was the size of the engineering team when you left Aledade?
Yeah, so the engineering team when I left was about 18 engineers, if I recall. These days, I think it's just about twice that size.
And were you a big part in the hiring process of building out the teams and how you wanted the team structure at Aledade?
Absolutely. Aledade was the first opportunity I had to really grow as an engineer. I'd had other engineering jobs that were good jobs. They just weren't the sort of scaling a startup type jobs that are so common these days. I went from being, I would say, a competent middle of the road engineer and had to simultaneously learn how to make the really important decisions, live with those really important decisions. And that's a bit of a feedback loop where you get better at making decisions when you have to live with them, as well as learning how to interview people effectively, because it's entirely possible to give a very detailed interview that is completely ineffective. And then once you hire people, make sure that they can grow into their role, make sure that they can ramp up on your technology, as well as the specifics of what your business is doing. I definitely had some stumbles doing that. One of the biggest moments for me was the first time I had to fire someone, which really brought home the gravity of the responsibility of being an engineering manager and really made me take a step back and think about how to better assess candidates. The short story there is that I'd had a very informal interview process that was almost entirely conversational. I hired somebody who could talk the talk, but once they got on board, unfortunately couldn't walk the walk, as it were. And after about 4 weeks, it was clear that it wasn't working out. And so we had to go our separate ways.
So taking on that type of a role, oftentimes when you're in a high growth startup environment, you kind of relied on to just take on certain tasks that maybe weren't in your initial job description. What are some of those things that maybe you felt could have helped make that a little bit more of a seamless transition as a leader?
I absolutely think that leadership training is very important. It's really hard to know whether or not you'll both be a good manager as well as whether or not you'll enjoy management before you try it. I think it's something that folks should absolutely try. I think that it is important, however, that there be some element of training, whether that be a third party class that people go to, or if they shadow a manager in their own company. I think the most important thing is that a lot of people get into management thinking that it will be very similar to their current role, just with some one-on-ones with people every week. In reality, the individual contributor components really take a back seat. The most important part of being a manager is making sure that your team is executing on the tasks that the company needs you to execute on. And as a manager, you really own the success or failure of that, although the best managers own the failures, but share the success with their team, of course. I think that just going into it with an open mind and thinking on all the best managers that you've had in your career really helps get people into the right headspace, as well as accepting that coding needs to take a back seat. And once you've acclimated to the role and you can figure out your capacity, then getting back into contributing as time allows.
That's helpful feedback. I'm curious if there's questions that certain engineers can ask in the interview process, if they're maybe anticipating a leap internally into a lead role that they can pose to a CTO or a VP or a leader within the organization to ensure that it's the right fit for them.
I think the most important thing that someone can ask when they're interviewing and are interested in managing is what the path that current managers at the company have taken is. So, for instance, are the current team leads internal hires that started out as individual contributors or not? If the answer is that yes, they were promoted internally, were they given any sort of resources to help them become a manager? As well as asking what the management style within the company is. Some places do one-on-ones only when you need them. Some places do one-on-ones every week, which is what I would recommend. And then trying to get a sense from the people you talk to during your interview as to what they like about the current vibe, for lack of a better word, within the company. It's really hard to get people to say anything negative about their company. One way I really like to phrase it when I'm interviewing is I ask first what they like most about their role to prime them, and then I ask them what they like least about their role. You can often get some honesty, particularly around sort of the software development lifecycle and how the management team influences that. So, for instance, if the response to what they don't like about the company is, oh, the deadlines are really tight, or none of the JIRA stories are ever fleshed out, but they don't change the estimates when it becomes clear there's more work to do, you can sort of read between the lines there and get a sense that the culture at the company might be to push really hard, work more than 40 hours a week. So being really attuned to the things that people aren't saying when they respond to your questions. It's a tough skill to master, but I always would recommend to my friends to interview even when you're not necessarily looking to jump ship. It can teach you about things that you're not currently aware of in your current role. Maybe you'll be really surprised by an opportunity and you'll want to change jobs. Or maybe you'll find out that you really like your current job and you want to stay there. All of those are useful things to know, though.
Yeah, getting a real authentic insider perspective is something that's super difficult to
Yeah.
obtain. Has hiring temporary or contract to hire as a trial period ever been a part of your all's hiring philosophy in your previous work?
Not in my current role, but I have done a couple contract to hire people in the past. It definitely can work. I think that the most important thing is being really upfront about the expectations as well as the opportunity for it to become a contract to hire, for that to really be followed through on. I think in a lot of cases, the phrasing of there's an opportunity to be hired after 3 months or 6 months or whatever is a lot different from we try to hire everybody that gets contracted. And there's a whole spectrum in between there. But you don't want to go contract somewhere for 6 months with the expectation of being hired only to be let down. That's really tough. Ramping up at a company often takes about half that time anyway. And so, got to be really clear eyed about what you're getting yourself into on both sides of that balance, being the hirer or the interviewee.